The Panzer Sparwagen 234 series was the peak of wheeled armoured combat vehicle in World War II. The series began production from early 1942 with 4 variants being made and in total 478 vehicles being completed. With its primary focus being reconnaissance, but as the war entered its later stages, this shifted to supporting combat roles and even into a tank hunter. But where did the story begin? Development of the Panzer Sparwagen was based off the older and already in use 8x8 wheeled vehicles being used by the German forces, as after the invasion of Poland and France, the German High Command had been impressed with how their lightly armed but highly mobile and hard-hitting vehicles could be very effective, especially in the Blitzkrieg strategy. But these early vehicles were based off civilian designs and converted, but the 234 series was designed as a military vehicle from the start, meaning components and equipment could be easily implemented and was far more efficient overall. Actual production began in 1942. It was a 4-man crewed vehicle comprising of a driver, commander, loader and gunner. The first variant being the SD KFZ 234/1, also known as the Gerät 95, had its main armament being a 2cm autocannon and around 200 were built. Secondly, in September 1943, the Puma arrived with 101 being built in total, and it was armed with the 5cm L60 main gun. Thirdly, was the SD KFZ 234/3, also known as the Stummel, with the L24 7.5cm main gun, with 88 being built starting June 1944. And finally, the SD KFZ 234/4, also known as the Gerät 96, and it became known to the troops as the Pak Wagon, armed with its Pak 40 L46 7.5cm main gun, with 89 being built starting December 1944. Altogether, 478 Panzer Sparwagen 234s were built, in all of the 4 variants combined. It wasn't the most numerous vehicle altogether, but it was definitely effective, and it was one of the most versatile, able to do reconnaissance, combat support, and even tank hunting. It was also known to help in anti-partisan duties with extremely good effect. The armament of the vehicles varied greatly, with the 4 main weapons being the 2cm KWK 30 L55 autocannon, the 50mm KWK 39 L60, which was originally intended for the Leopard light tank, but as this was cancelled, the turrets were reused for the Puma, the 7.5cm L24 short-barreled main gun, and the 7.5cm Pak 40 L46, all filling different roles, but when used together were very effective. All variants had a coaxial machine gun, with the MG34 sometimes being used on the Stummel, and the MG42 being used mainly on every other variant, depending on how many were available. Also on the Pak 40 variants, the MG would be inside the vehicle sometimes, for the crew to use in case of air attack, and if they needed to leave the vehicle to provide supporting fire. A major advantage these armoured cars had was their powerful telescopic sights, which were great for reconnaissance and helped with targeting to a highly accurate standard, and for calling in support such as mortars or artillery. They were also equipped with smoke launchers, which added greatly into the reconnaissance role, and if spotted, they could pop smoke, turn around and bolt in the opposite direction to safety, thanks to their immense speed. When it came to armour, all variants were fairly lightly armoured, as they were primarily reconnaissance vehicles, and even when carrying heavy armament, they were to do hit-and-run attacks and be in supporting roles. The armour was as follows: superstructure front 30mm at 40 degrees, superstructure side 8mm at 35 degrees, superstructure rear 10mm at 38 degrees, and the superstructure top 6mm at 87 to 90 degrees, depending on variant. Hull front 30mm at 35 to 50 degrees, hull side 8mm at 35 degrees, hull rear 10mm at 31 to 46 degrees, also depending on variant. Hull bottom 5mm at 90 degrees. Gun mantlet was 10mm at 40 degrees, and the turret for the Puma was front 15mm at 0 degrees, side 15mm at 35 degrees, and rear was 10mm at 0 degrees. There were only slight differences in the armour degree of sloping on the variants, but the thickness was the same apart from the gun mantlets and turret armour, with the Pak Wagon variant having significantly thicker turret mantlet. The mobility of the 234 series was very good, with the vehicle weighing around 11.5 tonnes loaded for combat, and just under 12 tonnes for the Puma variant. Compiled with its Tatra air-cooled V12 diesel engine, they could achieve around 50 miles per hour on a well-maintained road, and 37 miles per hour off-road as long as the terrain was not too rough. It ran upon 8 wheels, 4 on each side, and it had good ground clearance, as we're going to be handling rough terrain at speed. These combined features meant that the 234 series was extremely quick, and not only could it zoom around the battlefield, but its response time was very quick, making it greatly useful in rapid reaction forces. An extremely useful feature was that the vehicle could be driven backwards in case of emergency, or if the vehicle needed to back away, if the driver was injured or killed, the radio operator could then take over and drive. The 234 series fuel capacity was 350 litres and could achieve around 620 miles on roads and around 370 miles off-road, varying greatly depending on terrain and weather conditions. But this was great, and the range of the vehicle was massive. It meant the vehicle was very flexible in deployment and was well liked by crew and commanders alike. The 234 variants were at first attached to the Panzer Recon battalions, to mainly focus on reconnaissance, which was their intended role. But as the new, heavier armed variants arrived, they also began to be attached in larger numbers to Panzer battalions as well, in a more combat-focused role. And as the war entered the later stages, and as Germany's prospects looked more grim, Adolf Hitler himself ordered all production be focused on the Garrett 96 pack wagon variant, with its Pak 40 main weapon, as tank hunting became the priority to hold back the waves of Allied armour that were now closing in on the German forces. But how did these machines fare on the battlefield? Well, we'll go through each variant independently as they filled very different roles. Firstly, we have the SD Kfz 234-1 Grad 95. This was deployed to the battlefield in June 1942. This variant was fairly lightly armed, more in line with most armoured cars of the time, and its 2cm autocannon and coaxial MG42 was placed in an open-top turret. This made the crew more vulnerable, but was great for 360 situational awareness on the battlefield. It came with 250 stored 2cm rounds, and for its MG42 it had 2400 rounds. This was ideal for small engagements if the vehicle was spotted and came into contact with the enemy whilst on reconnaissance, but they were discouraged from entering combat unless attached to a larger force, as they were clearly situated in the support reconnaissance role, but could also do light anti-aircraft fire as well. The vehicle's high mobility was its best defence, and it filled the reconnaissance role very well, able to get in and out quickly and lead the fight into the bigger armoured vehicles. The 234-1 served on both the western and eastern fronts, but was too late to take part in the North African campaign, where its high mobility and range would have been very useful. But this was put to great effect on the Russian steppe, where large open spaces needed to be traversed quickly to get intel on the enemy. Then the 234-2 Puma variant arrived with a very different approach to this kind of vehicle. It emerged armed with a 50mm L60 instead of the 2cm autocannon and its coaxial MG42, which gave this armoured car the ability to knock out light and even medium tanks. It carried around 55 50mm rounds with a mix of armour piercing and high explosive, and around 2,850 rounds of 7.62 for the MG42. The Puma was, in my opinion, the first true combat reconnaissance vehicle, and really was ahead of its time. In design and the mix of firepower, speed and mobility gave it unparalleled performance in its role. It was mainly given to veteran crews who had used armoured cars before and would make use of it to maximum effect. Still, even with this extra firepower, it was still a light vehicle, and a single shot from even light anti-tank would knock it out, so it was still discouraged from engaging enemy armour or heavy enemy forces unless it had no choice. From all the info I could find, the Puma excelled in its role, and when acting in conjunction with a well-armed and supplied force, it was invaluable to well-skilled and tactical commanders. After the Puma, the 234-3 arrived, the Stummel as it was known, which had the short-barrelled L24 7.5cm main gun. This may seem an odd choice or even a step down from the 5cm L60, but due to it being a low-velocity gun, it meant that it could have more powerful high-explosive rounds, as the shells did not have to be reinforced, and its intended role was combat support, and with the use of heat rounds it was still effective against light and medium armour and could be a tank killer if the situation arose. It carried around 50 rounds of 7.5cm ammo, a mix of high explosive and heat rounds. The L24 was fitted into a fixed position as the turret-mounted 7.5cm would not fit in the chassis. It was open-topped but still relatively cramped, and due to its fixed position the vehicle had to regularly move to engage targets, which was not ideal in combat, especially with a very lightly armed vehicle that was susceptible to small arms anti-tank fire. Then finally, the 234-4 arrived with its mighty Pak 40 L46 7.5cm main gun. This tank slayer was the last thing you would expect on a vehicle designed for reconnaissance. It was Germany's attempt later in the war for an easy to produce but effective tank hunter, and production was shifted on the orders of Hitler himself. The idea behind it being the combination of heavy firepower and high speed, a true glass hammer in a sense, that could knock out all but the heaviest tanks, but could not survive anything but the lightest of enemy weapons. Fitting the Pak 40 into the 234 chassis was not easy, and it was cramped, and the recoil of the gun put a lot of stress on the structure and the wheels of the vehicle. In combat, they tended to be used in pairs, one armed with long-range radio equipment and the other with a short-range one. These tank hunting pairs could coordinate to destroy enemy armour using hit-and-run tactics, as their speed was their biggest advantage over slower and heavier vehicles. The 234 series and its variants were very well made and effective, and produced in relatively decent numbers to fulfil their roles, and they were respected by allies and enemy alike. And when these vehicles were captured by the Allied forces, they were very impressed, and the 234 definitely influenced armoured cars from years to come. In my opinion, it was a fantastic vehicle which was very ahead of its time. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching, and you guys have a fantastic evening.